Mike, could you give us a brief summary of your life before the accident of January 2015?
So I was born in Essex and grew up in England until I was 13, and then moved to West Wales in Pembrokeshire at that time. Progressed through school then and had some health issues as a teenager. I, in fact, actually had a brain tumour and was operated on when I was 14, and unfortunately had a difficult period when my parents divorced when I was 16. And then I finished my A-levels and was successful to go to medical school and went to Cardiff University. So I've been based in South Wales now for a very long time. Qualified there, and a year after I qualified as a houseman, I met Kirsten, my wife, and we got married a year or two later after that. And around the time that we got married, I'd felt God calling me in to do obstetrics and gynecology as a subspecialist career, and I had a training number, as we call it. So you complete your training, and after 7 to 10 years you would become a consultant, subject to meeting the training requirements and exams.
So Becky, what do you remember of Mike's accident?
I think my first memory is the phone call that I had off Kirsten. And it was early in the morning, just taking the kids to school, so it's the start of a new day, and Kirsten rang me in a proper frantic state. She knew that a terrible accident had happened, but didn't have many details, so I think, as is natural, your imagination fills in all the gaps, and she feared the worst. But I think the worst part of it was he was so far away, and she felt helpless. She had a small child, and she was also pregnant. So with all those sort of things just all crashing together in one panic state, really. And it was lovely that she felt that she could phone me, because they didn't have family close by at the time. And as her life group leader, that meant that I was perhaps her first point of contact in a moment of crisis. So yeah, it was straight away, it was, right, rally the troops, what do we do? And as women, we're very good at sort of, right, let's gather, what should we do? Prayer was obviously the first thing that we did, but also practical things. What can we do? Can we be with you? Can we get you to London? All these sort of things started to sort of fall into place. And that week is probably a bit of a blur, because we were just waiting for bits of information and working on what we could do with the information that we had. So the first week, nothing really happened practically wise. Yourself and Chris were the first ones to go in to see him, and then it was after that that we started this sort of rota system.
What was the response of the church that first Sunday after the accident?
It's a blur. The Sunday is a proper blur, but as you reminded me, Ty basically led it as you were away, and it was, abandon whatever we've got planned, because this is a member of our family who's in absolute dire straits. This is something that we just need to really press in and pray for, and rally the troops, so to speak. Yeah.
How did you find out about the accident?
I remember we were driving to the airport. It was early in the morning, and I think you'd received a text message to say that there'd been an accident. And I remember driving myself, and you explaining to me what had gone on. And as you were reading it, I think I was expecting to hear the worst, because it sounded awful. But we heard that he was he'd gone to hospital, and I think that was pretty much it really. I remember then we were in Atlanta, and we were getting updates by text message from people that were in Wales, and just hearing what the updates were. And we were hearing that Mike was alive, but he was in ICU. But also I think we were hearing about Kirsten and the situation there, and the fact that I'm not sure if she had given birth then, but I think she had, and it was just a horrendous situation. And I think for us being across the other side of the ocean, felt a little bit helpless. And to be honest, I was probably waiting for the news that I think a lot of people were, that Mike would lose his life.
As soon as we arrived back in London, the first thing we did was to take a tube across London to Whitechapel to visit Mike in the hospital there. What do you remember about that?
Doctor asked who you were, and I remember you saying, I'm Mike's pastor. And I don't think you said who I was, but I think they just thought I was with you and it was okay. And we were allowed through into this room that nobody else, I believe, had been in, and particularly from the church. And seeing Mike and seeing a man whose head was shaved, who didn't look like the person I knew, with cables and wires and machines all around him, and just seeing this lifeless body, and again, just not knowing what to do or what to say. I remember looking at him, looking at you, looking at the situation, and I remember you prayed for him, and I'd love to say I had the faith to believe that in only a few months Mike would be back alive and well, but I didn't. I thought it was hopeless, and I just didn't know what to do or what to say. And we then saw Kirsten, and I remember the emotion that she had for the whole situation, and again just feeling helpless myself, not knowing what to say. And I think having you there to lead that was so helpful. And I guess that experience was something that I'd never seen in 25 years of being alive. I'd never witnessed anything like that. I'd never seen anybody in a ICU situation, and was able to. And obviously what came next, it was a thrill to see, because I'd seen him at the worst.
So what's the next thing that you remember after going to bed that fateful evening?
So literally the first thing I can remember is being put in an ambulance, not knowing, well, really very hazy, not knowing what was going on. After subsequent, I know I was in an ambulance in London, and this ambulance then brought me to the Heath UHW hospital in Cardiff. And I remember arriving there. It's all a bit hazy, to be honest. You just, what was going, what am I doing here? What's going on? Obviously I had a lot of drugs on board, so you're quite suppressed in consciousness. I had a tracheostomy, and my you can see the scar on my neck at the time. Obviously, so I was quite sedated to make me less aware of that, I think. But yeah, I've literally, the next thing I can remember is just being put in this ambulance.
From what you were told, what happened to you?
Well, both from what I've been told, and I've read my own medical notes and had all their pictures and images for me to review, because I've presented this story both nationally and internationally at medical conferences. What had happened was I'd sleepwalked in the hotel I was staying at, and I have sleepwalked before, often at times of stress, so that wasn't a new thing in a sense. And there was a fire escape window which opens up fully, which was unlatched. And I know this because it was all a police crime scene as well, and they found my fingerprints on this fire escape, and found fingerprints on the balcony, which was on the window outside the hotel. And so I've literally walked over a balcony and fell head first some 36 foot onto a concrete paving outside. And this happened at 1 o'clock roughly in the morning, according to clocks which had gone dead at the time. And some people walking past in the morning, walking a dog, some chap heard a whimpering sound like an animal, went to see what had happened and found me, not knowing it was me, and reported to the hotel. The hotel said, "Oh, we've got a doctor staying with us, we'll go and get him to have a look and help you." And they went into my room and found the fire escape window, and became apparent that it was me. and an air ambulance was called, and I was air ambulanced to Royal London Hospital, which is one of the best trauma centres in the UK, I hasten to add, and I was taken there with significant injuries, which included my skull was entirely shattered and to pieces around less than an inch. I had arterial bleeding on my brain, which is called subarachnoid bleeding, which more often than not kills you, often instantaneously or very quickly afterwards. I had venous bleeding on the brain called a subdural hematoma. I'd also fractured my cervical spine in the back of your neck, fractured C3, 4 and 5, and us medics have a saying that C3, 4 and 5 keep you alive because they control the main muscle which helps you breathe, so you can't normally breathe after they're damaged. I'd also had I fractured multiple ribs and had my lungs full of blood, so that are called a hemothorax, and so my oxygen saturations were never above 70% despite full whack oxygen, which as most people know is not compatible with life normally, and had other fractures, minor in comparison, in the lower spine and in my pelvis, and yeah, I had a hyperpyrexia whilst in hospital, so I was boiling hot and had no oxygen, which generally is incompatible with life, in addition to all the other injuries which would normally kill anyone, and as I've listed you.
Were you found relatively quickly? You fell?
No, well, I said I was found at around 6 o'clock, so I'd been there for 5 hours, and you missed the golden windows, as we call them in medicine, to be found, so things weren't looking good. And to put it into perspective, after the police had worked out who I was with my driving licence and so on, they found my next of kin, Kirsten. The police knocked on her door that day and basically said to her, "You've got to come to London to watch your husband die." In fact, they were the words they said to her, and she was 36 plus weeks pregnant at the time with a 20-month-old toddler.
And what was the date of this?
It was the 18th of January 2015, and so needless to say, my wife it was a very stressful time for her and for the family. She went into labour, in fact, and gave birth to my second son on the 23rd of January, in intensive care almost in the Royal London, and they were still telling her that I would die at that point, so she had a newborn baby, and that I would die, and that was all that could be said. Obviously, by this point, people were rallying around. You know, she spoke to immediately. She tells me she made 3 phone calls. She spoke to her parents. She spoke to my colleague at work, who's actually a Christian as well, a consultant I work with, and he obviously sorted out the work side of things. And she spoke to Becky Sherman at church, who was our house group leader at the time, and she rallied the church in prayer updates, as I found subsequent. She was sending daily updates to the church by text or message, and everyone was on the knees praying, as I understand it. Services abandoned, extra prayer meetings put into place. I think, people from churches I've been to previously, I think the church arose and people were praying. I'm still hearing stories of people I've met years gone by who said, "Oh, you're the person we were praying for," and the prayer networks have gone out far and wide. And I think Chris Bullock's dad, I remember telling me he was praying for me out in Africa and Tanzania at the time. People everywhere were praying, and probably feel part of the story. Obviously no one's expecting me to be sat here talking to you after what I've just told you's happened.
You have, as only a doctor would, described your injuries as incompatible with life?
Yeah, so there were those 7 things there that, if you had them individually, you would expect someone to die. Obviously, there's not absolutes always in life. You never say 100%, but yeah, most of those 7 things, or all of them, you have a very poor prognosis, and you can pretty much expect most people would die. And there'll be plenty of famous people you have heard will have died of the things that I've said. You know, the subarachnoid bleeding is a big one. You'll see quite a number of famous people. Recently, Diego Maradona, that's what he died from. Many, it's incompatible with life normally. Your brain can't cope without the blood supply coming to it.
What do you remember about the process of recovery?
It was a lengthy one, obviously. We'll put it into context. Firstly, that I was in the coma for 7 weeks, and no one expected me to survive. After Kirsten says, after about 3 weeks when I hadn't died, then all the doctors were telling her was the best you could expect, that was I might be a vegetable, for want of better words, that I would be severely disabled, and no expectation of any quality of life, etc. I've forgotten to have severe white matter damage throughout my brain because of the bleeding and the lack of oxygen, so the brain was like mush on all the images. So there was not much hope given. Let's put it that way. And then when it looked like I might survive, still it was a very limited outlook. To put it in even more context, they considered switching the machine off. 3 anaesthetists had met together, the consultants, and only one wanted to carry on. And the medical rules are that everyone has to agree before you switch the machine off. So one wanted to carry on, and so they carried on. And so it was that close, to passing away, as it were. So yeah, once I got to Cardiff, the first thing was the tracheostomy. I had to learn to breathe and speak, see whether I could do that, and I had a speaking valve in. It was obviously that was successful, and had to then see how I could interact with people and absorb, as I say, the information, try to work out what on earth was going on. I was in UHW, then in a neuro HDU for around 2 weeks while that went on, then to a neurological ward for another week or 2, and then I went to a rehabilitation hospital called Rookwood Hospital in Cardiff, and was there for around 3 months. Firstly, there was the physical recovery, because I hadn't moved for such a long time, muscle wasting. There was a lot of physiotherapy and strengthening, and some extremely detailed psychological analysis, because obviously I'd been a doctor before. They needed to know, as it looked like I was recovering and was of sound mind, or sound enough mind anyway, that I wasn't going to be too disabled or wheelchair bound, and that you've got to start looking at what am I going to do going forward, what can, work wise, what sort of career can he have. Yeah, I had to have a lot of psychological analysis and input, because the rigours of being a doctor, if you're going to go back to being a healthcare professional, they had to check that I would be able to cope with that. And so there was a very lengthy psychological analysis before, in the May time, it was the end of May, it was approved that I could look at going back to being a doctor. I had a meeting then with my head of school and we call it the deanery, the people in charge of my training as a doctor, in June, to discuss how that might go. And I had a year-long phased return to work. Obviously, patient safety is very important. People, had to be supervised, and I went back very limited hours to begin with, 2.5 days a week, and gradually built up over time. And it was around a year later I started doing on call, and so and the Lord watched over me. I was ticking the boxes. I started doing operations again, doing what was expected of me, and coming back to work at a high level that I was before, which is really truly miraculous, because a year later I went into training again, and I sat the exam in September the following year, so 18 months later after the accident, or less than that, after I came out of a coma, passed it straight away. And went straight into major surgical training after having shown that I'd recovered. And I do laparoscopic, so it's minimal access surgery, doing hysterectomies now, and major gynae surgery now, and that was the training I started doing after I passed that exam and completed that. 2 years later I became a consultant and work here in South Wales now, and have continued doing that. Haven't collapsed or gone backwards or turned out to be brain damaged after all. And as I said, I've presented my images, the MRI scans of my brain, to international and national audiences. Obviously, people truly astonished at the recovery, but as much to demonstrate the support. I've received a lot of support from colleagues, both Christians and non-Christians, to help me on this road. And there's a lot of people to be thankful for, and a lot of people at church to be thankful for.
You describe it all as miraculous, but how would you, as a medic, define a miracle?
Well, simply put, when things are impossible, that they become possible. And I know in my case, as I've described, the incompatible with life bits of my injuries, I know from my own experience. Early on in my training, I did neurosurgery. I know the injuries. I went back to the team who I worked with as a colleague, as a houseman, that no one, people don't survive from this. And during my journey of recovery, I remember seeing other patients. There was a gentleman sat in the bed next to me. He was about 34, 35. He had a bleed on the brain like I did. He had to have half his brain cut out to save his life. Overnight, disabled, wheelchair bound. He was a lorry driver, and so he would never be able to work again. And I remember him looking at me one day and just saying, "How are you walking? How are you doing that?" And that, can I explain to you why God heals some people or answers prayer and for some and not for others? I'm not trying to even answer that question. But yeah, I was deeply humbled during the process of seeing what God had done for me, and the real knowledge of knowing that God had answered prayer. And it was a miracle that I was like I was. It wasn't just that I survived. It was the quality of life that I've returned to. And the colleagues who have met me say, it's Mike from before the operation, and it's the same Mike. So before the accident, and it's the same Mike who's come back afterwards, apart from a few more scars and injuries.
How would you describe your current situation in life and work?
So obviously, I didn't actually meet my son until he was about 10 weeks old, which was very difficult for me personally. That was the hardest thing to come to terms with, that I'd missed the birth of my son. But I did get to spend more time with the family as I had the phase return, and then I've got a daughter who was born a couple of years later, 2017, and so our family is complete now, and God blessed us with another child. No one probably would have expected that to have happened either. And we're stronger together as a family, and a united family. God has blessed us and protected us, and the wider family. Well, you find out who your friends and family are when you go through these things, and we've been blessed with fantastic friends, a fantastic family, fantastic church who have supported us hugely during this process, and really known Jesus' love through our church that we attend.
As you look back on it all, what do you make of all this?
The whole thing was just so bad in so many ways, not just his accident, but the fact that Kirsten was there and had given birth and all of that kind of thing. It was just a story that couldn't be made up. And amazingly, I'm so blessed and privileged that I got to see Mike in the worst moment of his life. And I got to visibly see what he looked like, because then I got to see what he looks like now and what he looked like in only months afterwards. He said hello, and I remember being absolutely amazed, because it was a miracle that I'd seen with my own eyes.
Mike, a simple question. Do you believe in miracles?
Yes, I do. and I believe I'm a living testament to that.
Thank you.